So part of what Rousseau is trying to do, I think, is show us what happens if you take Hobbes and Locke seriously and think them through. And so this is a lot of what's going on in the discourse on inequality, the second discourse. Rousseau is trying to think through some problems in Hobbes and Locke and come up with some solutions. So this discourse on inequality was written, it's dated 1754. It was an Enlightenment thing for local scientific academies, in this case, the Academy of Dijon, proposed a question and invited essays on the question. Rousseau's first discourse, which is a discourse on arts and sciences, had been written a few years earlier and had won the prize, also from the Academy of Dijon, where Rousseau basically argued that the Enlightenment was a bad thing, that the improvements in the arts and sciences were not leading to moral improvements in humanity. So this is an interesting problem, right? It was a very pessimistic take that Rousseau gave us on that, but well, there we are. So he thought he'd do it again, and he did not win the prize this time. This is a few years later. Partly because this is a fairly pessimistic account, and also partly because he's not, in some ways, he's not breaking new ground here, but he's summarizing a lot of stuff that's been thought and said before. So he begins in the preface, before he even gets to the question, right? He spends a couple of pages here talking about how we study humanity. And this is an interesting problem, right? This is an interesting issue because Rousseau says we don't really know human nature, and we can't know human nature. Why? Because human nature is not, human nature is constructed, right? It's constructed over a long period of time, and it's composed of layers, and we can't get back to the layers. We can't peel back the layers and see what the origins of it all are, because we're just too far away. Think of it this way, right? Think about genetics. We used to say that genetics, the genome was destiny, right? If you had a marker gene for X, Y, or Z, then X, Y, or Z would happen. And then we started discovering that wasn't actually how it worked. That genes have the opportunity to be turned on, but they don't necessarily get turned on. They might, I mean, but there are environmental causes or environmental contributions, and this is what Rousseau is talking about, right? That a given marker, a given trait, a given characteristic might get turned on or not turned on, depending on how history goes. And so he's taking really seriously the theory that Locke propounded in the essay concerning human understanding, that humans are born blank slates. And he said, yeah, okay, so let's see what happens with that. And he says, and they're really blank. And they don't have instincts, and they don't have innate ideas, and they don't have any of that stuff. And so what happens when all of those things develop over time? When we acquire things, right? When social transmission of characteristics, it turns out really to be the norm. And you see how this really profoundly influences the current shape of social sciences, at least in the United States, but actually truthfully worldwide, right? So he takes seriously Hobbes saying that the passions control, and he takes seriously Locke saying that we're blank slates. And he says, now what do we do with that? And so in the preface, this is his burden, is to sort of explain how the construction of humanity takes place. So yeah, so we're talking about the origins of inequality, right? For the classics, this is a non-issue. For Plato and Aristotle, inequality is just a feature of nature. This is just what happens. Some are better than others. Some are more emphatically equipped to do well than others. The purpose of the polity is to enable the best life, but not everybody is capable of the best life. We've talked about this. So it's the best life for those who are capable of it, but they're few by definition. And the resources and attention of political philosophy needs to be paid to those few. And we can forget about everybody else, right? For the moderns, this is a problem, right? How could people start out equal in the state of nature, which is their theory, and end up unequal in society? Equal in the sense that nobody is designated to rule anybody else. There is no natural entitlement to be in authority. So how could they wind up unequal in society? The purpose of the polity is to ensure that you're better off, right? And this improved life should be available to everyone. In principle, it's available to everyone. There's nothing denying it. So why is it that some are powerful, some are wealthy, and all that, and others are miserable? And this is what Rousseau really wants to investigate, right? Let's put it another way. To Plato and Aristotle, or sorry, to Hobbes and Locke, if we believe Hobbes and Locke, human beings are free to become anything. So how did they become what they are? And in Rousseau's France, of course, this is an important, a pressing issue, right? Because poverty in royal France is unbelievably crushing. It is destitution of a sort that we haven't. We don't know. We have. Even the United States has more of a safety net than this. So we begin then at the beginning. And he refers to he makes this classical reference, the statue of Glaucus, right? The human soul has been altered by society. So how is that? And you see at the end of that first paragraph, a reference to Hobbes, right? One no longer finds anything but the grotesque contrast of passion, which thinks it reasons, and understanding in the state of delirium. So we feel before we think, and our feeling directs our thinking in important ways. Our understanding is in a state of delirium, in a state of sort of chaotic, flighty searching for what? We don't know. So we can't know ourselves. That's impossible, Rousseau says. Right? The more we accumulate new knowledge, the more we deprive ourselves of the means of acquiring the most important knowledge of all. The farther we get away from nature, that is to say, human existence in an actual natural state, the farther we get away from that, the worse it becomes. And there's no going back. It's irreversible, right? And again, notice this is the liberal notion of progress, right? progress moves only in one direction. So, but these changes are very gradual, and we'll talk about that. Okay, so, and this is sort of the burden of the preface here. Right? And he comes. This is on 834 in the second column. There's a paragraph break, and just before that, he says, for the establishment of society, men must have used enlightenment, which develops only with great difficulty, and by a very small number of people within society itself. So creating society is not obvious or easy. And so people need to have progressed a long way from the beginnings of the state of nature. And so Hobbes and Locke, I think Rousseau rightly says, make it look too easy. In the state of nature, there are two things that humans have. And this is on 855 in the first column in that long middle paragraph, longish, right? I believe I perceive in the state of nature, in the human soul, in the state of nature, two principles prior to reason, of which one makes us ardently interested in our well-being and our self-preservation, and the other inspires in us a natural repugnance to seeing any sentient being, especially our fellow man, perish or suffer. So, sympathy and self-interest, these coexist. Well, I mean, of course, that's problematic because they can be at odds, right? So Rousseau sees these as being the sort of having to figure out what these operating principles are going to lead to. Now he makes it explicit, right? Rousseau is the father of animal rights. Kant is the father of human rights. Rousseau is the father of animal rights, parent, I should say. Right, at the bottom of 835, right, since they share to some extent in our nature by virtue of the sentient quality with which they are not, in other words, they feel, right? One will judge that they should also participate in natural right and that man is subject in some sort of duties toward them. So we have obligations to animals because they feel. You could say, right, Descartes' principle was, I think, therefore I am, in Latin, cogito ergo sum. Rousseau changes that, right? For Rousseau, it's I feel, therefore I am. I know that I exist because I can feel it. And so this is the principle that he's using going forward, right? We feel things. Our reason is a byproduct of all of this. Our reason is a very late development out of all of the education and so forth that we give ourselves and each other. Okay. So the question, 836, question proposed by the Dijon Academy, what is the origin of inequality among men and is it authorized by the natural law? Rousseau is kind of scandalized by this, by this last part of the question, the natural law part, because I don't think he believes that there is such a thing as natural law. So he goes on, right, to say, he makes a distinction between natural or physical inequality and moral and political inequality. And these two things, right, Plato and Aristotle had mixed them up. For Plato and Aristotle, one followed upon the other. Political inequality followed on natural inequality, and they were co-existent principles. Rousseau separates them, right? He said natural inequality is not worth talking about. And he wants to look for So he's going to tell us then here in this first bit, right? Precisely, let me try that again. Precisely what then is the subject of this discourse? To mark in the progress of things the moment when, right taking the place of violence, nature was subjected to the law. So how does inequality work within society? None of our previous philosophers, he says, have reached the state of nature. So Plato or Hobbes and Locke looked for the state of nature, but didn't get there. And we'll talk about that a little bit, but I mean, the basic critique of Hobbes and Locke is, for both of them, the people that they're describing as existing in a state of nature look a whole lot like 17th century Englishmen. And that's not, Rousseau doesn't find that persuasive, right? These are not the kinds of men that you can expect to find in the state of nature. So Hobbes and Locke must have it wrong, because the people that they're describing, the self-interested, rational actors that they're describing, probably didn't exist when the state of nature existed and when the social contract was formed. So, yeah, which is why they never. So he wants to put aside all the facts. Interesting. Why do facts not have a bearing on the issue? You can address this in the forum if you want. I mean, I think that what he's talking about is the degree to which people have written about, talked about, commented, prepared histories of, anthropologies of the development of humankind. And he says, the investigations that may be undertaken concerning the subject should not be taken for historical truths, but only for hypothetical and conditional reasonings, better suited to shedding light on the nature of things than on pointing out their true origin, right? So again, this is shrouded in mystery. We're in a fog when we try to understand what the origin of human inequality is, what the origin of human society is. It's just too long ago. So let's make some hypotheses about it, but let's not take them for facts. I think that's what he's saying. Okay. So what is man in the state of nature? Well, he's an animal. He has no language, he has no clothes, he has no regular sources of food, he has no family, he has no religion, he got nothing. He sleeps under a tree, he eats acorns that he finds, probably slugs too, and things like that, you know. He probably smells, never in his or her life has a bath, right? This is primitive. I mean, Rousseau takes us all the way back. So he hypothesizes that humans are already walking on all fours, that we know that happened at some point, right? Chimpanzees walk on two legs, not on all fours. We know that chimpanzees and gorillas do that, sometimes, not always. So we see the origins, the very primitive origins of human nature. At the bottom of 837, so the second paragraph of part 1, right? I see an animal less strong than some, less agile than others, but all in all, the most advantageously organized of all. And it turns out that the reason for that is the brain. So, because this is what he tells us in that next paragraph, right? Whereas each species has only its own instincts, man, who may perhaps have none that belongs to him, appropriates all of them to himself. So we see what others do. We see what opportunities there are. And we say, I can do that. And we do it. Rousseau says this is really the ground of human superiority, because we can adapt anything. We can learn. As he will say later on, we're perfectible in ways that other animals are not. And the perfectibility and freedom are the two, they're really inseparable principles for Rousseau, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So children are born, again, this is a perfectly primitive situation. Human beings don't even recognize each other if they see each other twice. So mating takes place casually. If they meet each other, maybe they don't meet each other, right? So he's really writing out everything that we associate with the idea of sort of settled political existence, right? Because even the family is a political institution. So taking us all the way back, he gets in a few cheap shots at medicine, right? Most of our ills, on 839, most of our ills are of our own making, and we could have avoided nearly all of them by preserving the simple, regular, and solitary lifestyle prescribed to us by nature. Rousseau's favorite activity, by the way, his favorite leisure time thing, was to get out in a rowboat in the middle of a lake and just sort of lie on his back in the rowboat and stare at the sky and enjoy the sensation of existence. For him, that made him feel most completely human. And you can see some of this coming through in the dialogue here. So, therefore, he says, this is on 840 in the first paragraph, first complete paragraph, therefore we must take care not to confuse savage men with the men we have before our eyes. Nature treats all animals left to their own devices with a partiality that seems to show how jealous she is of them. Humans are formed differently from most animals. And so knowing humanity, knowing the human animal, means going all the way back, but understanding that the primitive animal is different from the animals that we see. Okay, so savage man is a light sleeper, right? Savage man has handy objects, rocks, sticks, etc., to use as weapons. So to the extent he's concerned about self-preservation, he's got the materials already at hand. But on 841, he introduces something that is interesting and new. So in the paragraph that continues over from 840, he says, I am aware of precisely the same things in the human machine, with the difference that nature alone does everything in the operations of an animal, whereas man contributes as a free agent to his own operations. The former chooses or rejects by instinct, and the latter by an act of freedom, right? So we are free to be different than we were yesterday. We are free to change. We are free to improve. We are free to make progress. And that freedom is connected, Rousseau says, with our perfectibility, right? The freedom is necessary in order for us to be perfectible. Because if we weren't free to do it, we couldn't do it, right? Animals are not free to perfect themselves. Animals are locked in to instinct. Humans are not locked into instinct. Humans are free to reject what their parents have done or what they have done the day before. They're free to change and do something new. That freedom for Rousseau is extraordinary, is amazing, is the thing that makes humans human. And that becomes for modernity, right? But even within sort of social contract theory, Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau, this freedom is the important principle, the really driving principle that works in politics. So, therefore, 841, therefore it is not so much understanding which causes the specific distinction of man from all other animals as it is his being a free agent. So, physics, he says, explains in some way the mechanism of the senses and the formation of ideas, but the power of willing, or rather of choosing, and in the feeling of this power, we find only purely spiritual acts about which the laws of mechanics explain nothing. Hobbes may have been on a good track, right, in thinking that he could explain politics geometrically. But that is not sufficient, Rousseau says. We need to understand the spiritual dimension. Look how this anticipates the distinction between the hard sciences, right, on the one hand, and the social or social sciences or humanities on the other, right? The mechanical and the spiritual. That distinction for Rousseau works throughout this, but he's really more concerned with the spiritual. He's more concerned with how human beings use their freedom and move that freedom in ways that lead to improvements in the human species. But he says, of course, it's also they don't use it well, and that's really in the second part. They use it to oppress each other, right? So he concludes then, 841, right? There is another very specific quality which distinguishes them, and about which there can be no argument: the faculty of self-perfection. So our freedom leads to our ability to perfect ourselves. And in so doing, perfect the species, because these learned attributes then become part of who we are, right? Remember the statue of Glaucus, right? We learn an attribute and it is there in our minds. And pretty soon we assume it's natural. Language is one of those things. And we'll say some more about that very soon. Right? A faculty which, with the aid of circumstances, successively develops all the others and resides among us as much in the species as in the individual. So Marx is going to talk about species freedom. And species freedom means this idea, the idea that you as an individual are constrained in many ways by your heredity, by your culture, by your parents, by your language, by your religion, all of those things. But the species is free to develop and become something other than what it is. Even though you are limited, you as an individual are limited, right? So this is what Rousseau is talking about. We have this species freedom that allows humanity to move forward, to change, to grow. Even if the individual in a particular circumstance or a particular society might not grow. Okay. So again, end of 841, he invokes Hobbes, right? He doesn't mention Hobbes here, but this is who he's talking about. Whatever the moralists may say about it, human understanding owes much to the passions, which by common consensus also owe a great deal to it. right? So reason and passion go together. It is by their activity that our reason is perfected. We want stuff. We don't want stuff. We desire an aversion, and that leads us then to move to reason in particular ways. So, yeah, 842, right? He's talking about foresight. He's talking about, again, he's back in primitive times. Second column of 842, the more one meditates on this subject, the more the distance from pure sensations to the simplest knowledge increases before our eyes. So Rousseau turns to the problem of how this develops, right? The very, very slow accretion of things. How many times, he says here on 842, and how many times perhaps did each of these secrets die with the one who had discovered it? How many times did we have to discover baking bread or making beer or planting seeds, right? How many times did we have to discover again that we could do it? How does learning take place, right? It's slow, it's incremental. And so, right, the progress begins in very, very small things and very, very small ways. But it accumulates. And each step in progress allows us to make more steps and bigger steps. And so Rousseau is really giving a kind of an anthropological account of all of this. Right, what progress, on 843, what progress could the human race make scattered in the woods among the animals? So, but we also can't trust each other, as he also says. So how do you account for this? You can't learn if you can't communicate, right? You can't teach anyone else. You can learn, but you can't teach anyone else if you can't communicate. Sorry. So how do you communicate? If humans have no language, how do they communicate with each other? And so 843 here, let us consider how many ideas we owe to the use of speech, how much grammar trains and facilitates the operations of the mind. Now, you notice this is speech teaching the mind, not the mind teaching speech. The mind is not primary for Rousseau. The speech is, or speaking is. May I be permitted to, right? How many thousands of centuries would it have been necessary to develop successively in the human mind the operations of which it is capable, right? So this is a very slow accumulation, and it's increasing, and it's sort of geometric progress, right? So every century it doubles. And eventually you get somewhere, right? Eventually you get to an 18th century where knowledge is developing rapidly. But that depends on a whole lot of relatively stupid centuries, right? Where doubling knowledge means how to keep yourself warm at night. Okay, so language, right? Where does language come from? Now, Plato and Aristotle had talked about common nouns, right? And there was, for them, the common noun was in the mind. And Rousseau talks about this, right? Where does language even come from? We don't know, because we don't know human beings who don't use language. It's a technology, right? It's like government. It's a technology that is so obvious and assumed by us that we don't know where it came from. So, and how is speaking connected with thinking, right? We think in words. We don't think in symbols or in abstractions, or oh, okay, maybe mathematicians do. They're a breed apart. But we think in words, right? And we think, well, let me put it this way. To what extent are the words the thoughts, right? So is language necessary for us to speak, or is speech necessary for us to think? Rousseau says that's an interesting question. He doesn't try to answer it, but he admits that that's an interesting question. So he says, he claims at first, we tended to give, if we were naming things, we would name them all separately. So one tree would be Larry and one tree would be Marvin, and other trees would have other names. But we wouldn't necessarily connect them all as trees. So where does the idea of grouping them come from? Where does the idea of tree come from, right? This was Plato. Plato says ideas exist in nature. Ideas exist, and our minds inherently are aware of the connection among trees, among the things that unite trees. Rousseau says, we don't necessarily see this. We see individual things. We see particulars out in the world. The idea of a tree, right? The abstract notion, tree, is something that we have created for ourselves. We have grouped individual things in ways that allow us to talk about it meaningfully and to think about it meaningfully. But that's not how the world actually works. The world works with individuals, right? So, as he says, this is on 845, in the paragraph he begins, moreover, general ideas can be introduced in the mind only with the aid of words, and the understanding grasps them only through sentences. Further on down that paragraph, every general idea is purely intellectual. The least involvement of the imagination thereupon makes the idea particular. Try to draw yourself the image of a tree in general. You will never succeed in doing it, right? You're always going to produce a particular tree. It's going to be big, or it's going to be little, or it's going to be pyramidal, or it's going to be round, or it's going to be some other shape, or it's going to be deciduous, or it's going to be evergreen, right? You cannot draw tree. You can only draw a tree. Rousseau says general ideas are not, in this he agrees with Plato, of course. General ideas have no particular shape. They're general. It's like the infinitive, right? The infinitive of a verb, to be, to go, right? It is not qualified by place, time, history, any of those things, right? To go is not went, is not going, is not on my way, right? But to go, it's just a generality. The definition of a triangle alone gives you the true idea of it. So Rousseau says, somewhere along the line, we acquired the ability, to create ideas. Where we did it is not clear. That it's critically important is also clear. right? We need to be able to do that in order to in order to reason in the way that we do. Um, I hope that's clear enough. We can talk about it in the forum if you want. Uh, what was necessary, 845, which was the more necessary an already formed society for the invention of languages, or an already invented language for the establishment of society? Again, where does all this come from? So, 846, Rousseau is, again, he's looking for the origins of inequality. And at the bottom of that long paragraph at the beginning, in the first part of 846, in instinct alone, man had everything he needed in order to live in the state of nature. In a cultivated reason, he has only what he needs to live in society. Now, it's not clear. Rousseau just said that human beings don't have instincts. So why he's saying that instinct alone is necessary for living in the state of nature is not as pristine, is not as clear, is not as obvious as it might be. So this is something we need to think about and talk about. But the point is, right, that human beings in the state of nature have certain sentiments, have freedom, and therefore the ability to become more perfect, but not much else. But they're not bad, right? Hobbes, he says, above all, let us not conclude with Hobbes that because man has no idea of goodness, he is naturally evil, that he is vicious because he does not know virtue, that he always refuses to perform services for his fellow man he does not believe he owes them, or that by virtue of the right which he reasonably attributes to himself, to those things he needs, he foolishly imagines himself to be the sole proprietor of the entire universe. Hobbes is wrong, Rousseau said. Humans are not like that. He takes it in a false sense. And this is why, sort of on the bottom of 846, bear with me. On the bottom of 846, right, he says precisely the opposite, because he had wrongly injected into the savage man's concern for self-preservation the need to satisfy a multitude of passions which are the product of society and which have made laws necessary. So it's like I said, the human that Hobbes is describing is a social human and not a primitive human, which is what Rousseau is looking for. Okay. So, and where does this, so Hobbes and Locke both argue that the state of nature is a state of war. Rousseau says, no, that's not true. And that's not true. And so this is one of the big disagreements in the modern world, right? Are humans naturally bad, or are humans naturally good? And as I said, with regard to Hobbes, humans are naturally fearful. I don't think that proves that they're naturally bad, but Rousseau thinks that that's exactly what Hobbes argues. And so in that sense, my dear colleague, Dr. Nagengast, believes that Rousseau is right, that Rousseau is interpreting Hobbes correctly. I'm not sure about that. But for Rousseau, right, the great quality that humans have in the state of nature is, as he says on 847, an innate repugnance to see his fellow men suffer. Why that might be true is not clear, right? I mean, it's this natural instinct of pity. And so where, I mean, and we know, right, from observation that human beings are actually perfectly willing to torture one another, to be cruel to one another. So where does that come from? And for Rousseau, I mean, this is the important point, right? For Rousseau, that's social training. That's learned. So that's not natural. That is not human instinct. The human instinct is to be compassionate, to be pitiable. Right? So, right? This is 848. He draws the conclusion from this. Second line, reason is what engenders egocentrism, and reflection strengthens it. Reason is what turns man upon himself. Reason is what separates him from all that troubles and afflicts him. Philosophy is the enemy for Rousseau. Philosophy is our great stumbling block. So we have, at some level for Rousseau, we have gotten so far from our primitive nature, from our connection with each other, from our instinct of pity, right, that it's impossible for us to go back. It's impossible for us to do what we should do. Right? You just place your hands over your ears and argue with yourself a little, and you don't hear the cries of those who are suffering. But Rousseau says this is what preserves human nature. Pity is a natural sentiment, which by moderating in each individual the activity of the love of oneself, contributes to the mutual preservation of the entire species. So where do we get that sort of concern for each other? And this is where Rousseau gets it. So reason separates us, pity brings us together. And he continues to talk about love. It's not altogether clear. I mean, just a biographical fact. It's not altogether clear what Rousseau knows about love. He ultimately he had a long affair with and ultimately married an illiterate washerwoman, just a domestic servant. They had 4 children, and Rousseau gave them all away. Shipped them off to be adopted, and who knows what became. He just didn't care. So Rousseau is not exactly the best example of kind of familial loyalty, familial feeling. And you have to wonder where the celebrated sense of pity is in all of that, that he would give them away. And you wonder why the woman stuck with him, but there we are. Okay, so when he talks about love, he may not be someone to take entirely seriously. But he says, right, that the sort of family foundation that exists because of the sentiment of tenderness for others, that in humans, this is an inherent part of their existence, that we have, partly because of the physiological necessity of taking care of children longer than other species have to take care of children. But it means that our matchings, our matings, last longer than those of other species. So On 850, he begins to really kind of sum up the paragraph, that primitive man starts out with these two characteristics, right? Self-preservation and pity, that he is free, and because he is free, he is perfectible, and he is perfectible because he's perfectible, he's free. But it's slow, right? Art perished with its inventor. There was neither education nor progress. Generations were multiplied to no purpose. Remember, Hobbes had said this, right? That passage that ends solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. There is no art, no place for industry because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of commodities that may be imported by sea. This is on 619, no commodities building, no instruments of moving and removing, such things as require much force. No knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society. And what's worst of all, fear of violent death. Rousseau says the same thing, but he removes the fear of violent death. There's just no progress. So the species can go on for a long time in this kind of childhood that he describes. Now the question is, where does inequality come in? Where is that? I mean, if natural law is the thing that authorizes inequality, what is it? Where does it come from? And how does it operate on the first human beings, right? I mean, if it operates, it should have operated on the first human beings just as much as it operates on us now, if you really mean natural law. So this is an interesting question. And so he concludes by this turn to the political. Mastery, right? How will he ever succeed in making himself be obeyed? How do you put someone in subjection to you? And if you're trying to enslave me, where do I get the idea that I have to obey you, right? If someone chases me from one tree, Rousseau says, I'm free to go to another. If someone torments me in one place, who will prevent me from going elsewhere? Right? Is there a man with strength sufficiently superior to mine, and who is, moreover, sufficiently depraved, sufficiently lazy, and sufficiently ferocious to force me to provide for his subsistence while he remains idle? I mean, this is, where does this come from? And he goes on, right? He must resolve not to take his eyes off me for a single instant, to keep me carefully tied down while he sleeps, for fear that I may escape or I would kill him, right? So the origin of mastery is just as hard to come up with as the origin of language. How do you get there? Right? It is impossible to enslave a man without having first put him in the position of being incapable of doing without another. So we have got to the point, right, where we understand that somehow society is necessary, established relationships are necessary in order to create the inequality that makes slavery possible. He still hasn't told us how this happened, but he has set the stage then for what we're going to find out in part 2, right? So the various chance happenings perfect human reason while deteriorating the species. This is the great objection that Rousseau has. The species is getting more and more problematic as it grows, as it perfects itself. It is growing less and less moral, It's growing more and more indifferent. It's growing uncaring, unconcerned. So we will get there when we get to part 2, and I will talk to you in a couple of days about that.